If you've ever tuned into my channel before, you probably know I'm not a huge lore guy. I'm not the kind of person to fall in love with a story just because there's a vague idea that somewhere eventually there will be a substantial amount of additional depth. So you can imagine my disappointment when I tuned in to watch the Walton Files after seeing the trailer for episode 5's debut on Friday night, is what I would be saying if the series hadn't become the poster boy for how time to mature is an important part of everyone's artistic process. Hi, Zach Glenn, aka Glenn the Golden here, and I hope you'll join me for a few different ways that I plan to poke and prod at the Walton Files. I want to look at how the Walton Files grew from another amateur production of Five Nights at Freddy's fanfiction to its own fully realized animated horror series, analyzing where it got its visual inspiration to make that transition into a more mature level of artistic expression before finally stopping to explain my theory on the problem with theories and present a series of predictions on where the series will go from someone who just tuned in this week for the first time. But first, a quick bit of self-promo. I make YouTube videos with a focus on horror fiction and a podcast about conspiracies/true crime and their intersection with movies, though it is on a little bit of a hiatus. If these are the kinds of ideas you love to see, I upload around once a week, and I'd love to have you aboard the Golden Order. Also a reminder that as I'm just getting my footing in the algorithm right now, every single like, comment, and subscription is a huge help. Now, enjoy the show. Chapter 1. Do I look like I know what a Yumi shipper is? Subtitle, I am Monk. Well, the Walton Files had started out as another dime a dozen Five Nights at Freddy's copycat by a young artist taken in under the wings of the subgenre of mascot horror within the broader genre of horror fiction. The series has evolved into one that both pays homage to modern greats and recognized classics of the horror genre, while simultaneously outwriting all of the output I've seen from the Five Nights at Freddy's series. Basically, I think this has developed into a bit of an Oreo versus Hydrox cookie situation, where the imitator is possibly the one that will end up having the more popularity as time goes on. Which, if you didn't know, the Oreo was not the first cookie sandwich, it was only the one that managed to capture the public's attention, which I think may end up being the case here. Not the first to come by, but certainly the best written that I've seen so far. I don't want to focus too much on the comparison to Five Nights at Freddy's, because I think it does a little bit of a disservice to how much the Walton Files has grown since episode 5 in its artistic expression. But I do want to talk about what the series is doing right, and a lot of the examples are in direct contradiction with what Five Nights at Freddy's is doing wrong. You see, I really think that Five Nights at Freddy's has devolved into a fandom-captured merch-selling scheme. There's not really an interest in telling a story as much as there is in getting people interested in the next characters for the next merch drop. As someone with no real investment in mascot horror as a subgenre, my interest in both of these series really begins and ends with what they can do for horror as a genre overall. Someone who is, unfortunately, as I've said, unk. I don't really have the level of background knowledge that a lot of people do on these series, and if you're someone who can fill me in on any of this stuff, I'd love for you to actually leave comments. I do tend to read all of them, at least right now, as the channel is relatively small, but I happen to notice that The Living Tombstone, a channel that I mostly recognize as that one that does the FNAF music videos, happened to put out a video the day after the 5th episode of the Walton Files released. That is, one that a lot of people are interpreting as a critique or a dissatisfaction with the state of the storytelling in the FNAF series. Now, I've also seen some FNAF fans saying that anyone who interprets it that way is a tourist, but of course I'm just visiting because staying in the FNAF fandom would have me hitting the Hillary Clinton "you live like this" pose. And look, I already said I'm the first person to acknowledge that lore doesn't matter when you're establishing a story for an audience, but there's a huge difference in the idea of lore not mattering and what a lot of people have started to suspect is going on with FNAF. The author doesn't have any planned payoff for the audience that he's cultivated. There's already a stark difference in how the mysteries of Five Nights at Freddy's have played out, as breadcrumbs and jingling keys to keep an audience engaged in plot lines and give future plot lines the appearance of forethought, and why I would say the resolution of the primary mystery at the heart of the Walton Files doesn't matter also. The primary mystery in the Walton Files is the identity of the spirit that is calling itself Bon. However, Martin Paredes, the showrunner for this series, has been writing it in such a way that the resolution of the Bond mystery will feel like it has a gratifying closure regardless of how it resolves. The biggest reason for this is that the two competing theories both have to incorporate the evidence of the other theory, and there are essentially only two competing theories. The first theory is that the Bond spirit is Jack after he died, and in his grief has been trying to reinvent himself as the animatronic that his wife had based on him. The second theory is that Bond is a separate ghost, whose likeness to Jack is because he wants to put Rosemary in a position where she will allow herself to be killed. You can quickly see that because there's really only two theories, and that both have to explain why the evidence for the other theory exists, that while I've picked up on the fact that there's some degree of campism in the fandom, that from a neutral audience member's perspective, either conclusion would be fairly satisfying. You can contrast that directly with some of the FNAF mysteries that have been laid directly where almost no conclusion is going to be satisfying for someone who isn't deep in the fandom. It's because of this that I'm willing to grant that Paredes already has a firmer grasp on storytelling than Scott Cawthon, despite being significantly younger. The difference really shows the divide between two people, one who is interested in mascot horror as a storytelling vehicle, and another who is interested in mascot horror because it has the attention of young gamers and makes for easy merch tie-ins. Chapter 2. Why is this good? Subtitle. Everyone needs to be more well-read. I think that's more than enough comparing the series to FNAF, but as a series that started with a Blue Rabbit animatronic named Bond as opposed to Bonnie, I think some level of a comparison is necessary because, like I said earlier, Martin Paredes is already doing animatronic-based horror better than what he was originally imitating. While the characters don't necessarily look that similar, the differences have only grown more stark as the series aged. Paredes' early art isn't bad by any stretch of the imagination, but the art in Faces of Grief is stellar. While characters don't move their mouth, something that might be jarring for people more used to traditional cartoons, there has been so much growth in this series over the course of its 6-year lifespan. There's a lot of brilliant usage of drawings of rooms without characters or movement in it that uses dialogue to move the plot along while not needing to create multiple frames of animation, and it's done in such a way that allows for a greater attention to detail from Paredes and his art team in each individual scene. I think what makes the difference the most stark is if you compare the model for Bond in the series pilot with the model used for Bond in his conversation with Rosemary in episode 5. This is clearly the work of an artist who has put both his time and money into his ability to push his craft as far as possible. The film that Rosemary is working on with her puppets also showcases the growth of Paredes and his team over the series' development. In this sequence, Rosemary's puppet stabs Felix's puppet to death while the faces of their two children stare on in horror in the clouds. Lastly, I think the growth was apparent in the Alf model work done with Rosemary's character as she approached her fatalistic end where she would become Shaw the Lamb. As Rosemary's sanity declined and she approached her fate, she began to take on less human and more animal qualities, looking especially like a lamb when depicted in profile, giving her an almost muzzle-like appearance. I'm not a visual artist by trade, so I'm sure there will be analysis in the coming weeks by guys in the YouTube horror scene like Anthony Gallego, who I've watched and enjoyed for quite some time, who I know is Paredes for the Pumpkin Rabbit Halloween entry in the I think it's a non-canon series. I'm not really super well, again, not a lore guy. But even as someone who loves art broadly, the improvements were apparent to even a relative layperson in the art world like myself. I'm going to continue to heap some praise on Faces of Grief, but there's one area where if I want to take myself seriously as a critic, I would be remiss not to point out that the show has room to improve on. There are areas of the script where they really needed to work on their line delivery. I think what's striking about these spots in the script is that some of them come from some of the strongest actors in the episode overall. For example, while it would be a little easier to pick on Paredes' performance as Jack when he's talking to Sophie, there were parts of Rosemary's argument with Sophie where she also had problems in her line delivery, primarily not putting an emphasis on the times where she swears at Sophie in that conversation. I don't think any of the actors' performances are so bad that they can't completely fix the problems prior to the release of episode 6, but with the amount of responsibility that falls on Paredes as the director of an animated series, which has more going on in production than a live series, he should strongly consider bringing in either a dialogue coach or assistant director who's focused on line delivery to work with the cast during the recording of each of these voice lines. Martin, if you're looking for someone with experience in high school and college theater to coach, I am available. Also, if he is not currently doing this, I would strongly suggest that he has people who are conversing in a scene record their lines together. Doing so typically results in a better performance for both actors. All that said, I do think the acting is another area to acknowledge that there's been a good share of growth since the earliest days of the series. If you go back and look at Bunny Farms, I think the difference in the performance for Sophie in particular is night and day. While I did enjoy Bunny Farms and saw it as the series sticking a claim at trying to tell its own story, the actual performances were mostly enjoyable to me, and they were reminiscent of the cheesy acting in the Goosebumps TV show from my childhood. However, the performances in Faces of Grief have notably improved, and the growth is most apparent in monologues, which is why I suggest having the voice actors record dialogue together. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention the biggest standout, which is, and I guarantee you I'm pronouncing this person's screen name wrong, bear with me. I'm going to say Bravey. It looks kind of like Bravey. Bravey's performance as Bond. Between the after effects done on Bravey's voice and the scene where Bond is trying to convince Rosemary to allow him to kill her, I found the performance to be absolutely on par with any professional voice acting performance. And while I'm not sure if it would be as effective if it were given more airtime, I'd have gladly watched another 30 minutes or more of Bravey's Bond performance. It's a hard expression to say, Bravey's Bond performance. One of the other details that shows a ton of progress over the course of the series are the visual references being made by Paredes during the series. And for this, I am going to try to put up some example stills from each of the films that I'm talking about, at least as far as their visuals are relevant. The first that I want to talk about are all of the references to Hereditary, and I felt like there were quite a few. Essentially, many of the scenes that show Rosemary working on her Faces of Grief video are remarkably similar to the scenes where the mother in Hereditary, Annie, played by Toni Collette, are working on her miniature tableaus in that film. I think Hereditary as a visual reference makes a lot of sense with the themes that Paredes is attempting to invoke in his series. Both series have a somewhat fatalistic tone for their characters. That is to say that once the events of the plot have begun, there is nothing that anyone can do to stop them from unfolding. Hereditary is also notable for the fact that its plot involves a family being killed off one by one to create a new host for the reincarnation of the demon Paimon, which, as a visual reference, could spell out a grim fate for Sophie in the coming episodes. However, Paredes could also be evoking Hereditary's fatalism primarily because of the path Jack and Rosemary's grief set them on was fatalistic, which could mean that we see Sophie spared. I'm not really sure what's going to happen to her yet, though I know that at some point she's going to be very relevant to the plot. Hereditary isn't the only visual reference that Paredes pulls from, primarily because of the associations around Rosemary. Rosemary's Baby is also used as a visual reference when Rosemary goes up to the crib with the mobile of Ed and Sally's spirits in her dream sequence. The only real difference is that Rosemary in the Walton files is disgusted because she reveals her children are dead rather than coming face to face with a demon-human hybrid. There's also a non-visual reference in the actual title of the episode, / the film Mary is producing, / the title that Bond gives his version of that film. Faces of Grief and Faces of Bliss seem to be a reference to the series Faces of Death, which is an exploitation film that is most famous for bringing gore to a wider audience than just those who sought out shock videos. While there was no real narrative in Faces of Death, I feel the connection that is being made instead is toward the gore of your comfort character that you're going to be experiencing during Faces of Grief. There are two visual references that I noticed that I don't think are ultimately as important thematically for the series, and also may not even be as intentional as the other two, given how long animation takes as a process, but I want to throw them in this section because I feel that, even if unintentional, they show that Paredes is operating within these same schools of thought as other young creators who are being lauded as auteurs in the horror scene. And if you're unfamiliar, the term auteur simply means author. It is used to describe someone that has enough input in their creative process that you can tell that something noticeably belongs to them, and usually is used to describe something that also has some degree of artistic merit. In this case, I'm talking about Obsession and The Backrooms. The first comparison here is the scene with Rosemary after Jack first disappears. The fact that she stays in the hallway waiting for him to return home until she receives the phone call from him the night after he was supposed to return. When she's standing in that scene, and then continues to stand there after she leaves, it's incredibly reminiscent to the shot in Obsession, where Nikki stays in one place after Bear leaves to work his first shift that she is not also working. Remember, Nikki is Bear's co-worker in that film, in addition to having that long crush on her that goes back to high school. Another similar scene that is likely coincidental are the missing posters for Jack Walton that have been plastered up all over the Walton home. The sequence is very similar to the shots in Backrooms in Mary's childhood home when her mother has plastered up papers all over their home so no one can see inside. As I said, both of these sequences are likely coincidences in my mind, unless Paredes got advanced screenings of both of these movies, but it shows that the direction of all three stories are interested in similar visual motifs, similar ways visually of telling a story. There's also a somewhat older visual reference that I'm not sure is intentional, so I'm including it with these other possibly incidental references. If you pay close attention in many scenes, you can find Bond as an apparition in multiple scenes after Jack's disappearance. However, they're often not noticeable, and it's very possible you only caught one or two of these on your initial watch. The insertions of Bond's specter in scenes that aren't related to Bond felt very similar to Lake Mungo, where after a family's daughter dies, seeing a vision of her corpse, their son begins faking a haunting by inserting images of her into family videos, only for it to be revealed to the audience at the end of the film that her spirit was appearing in the footage in places other than where her brother had inserted the image. Lake Mungo is a top horror film for me, so any story that seems to have anything similar going on visually is going to get its laurels, at least on this channel. The attention to visual motifs isn't the only visual aspect that really shines in Faces of Grief either. Paredes and his team show that they are real masters of visual storytelling in this entry in the series. One scene that I think is particularly interesting is when the audience gets to see brief flashes of some of Rosemary's paintings as the radio plays some recent news stories after Jack's disappearance. One of the more interesting paintings that were shown during the sequence is one where Jack, Ed, and Molly's specters can be clearly seen outside of a window, almost beckoning to Sophie. One part of the image that you can't really make out unless you pause the frame and take some time to examine it is that Sophie's head in the painting appears to be covering up a fourth specter, which feels like it could be Rosemary predicting her own death through her artwork. However, there's also another interpretation that takes away Rosemary's agency in predicting her own death. As I mentioned earlier, after Jack's disappearance, not Bond can be seen haunting Sophie and Rosemary, so it's plausible to me too that these visions of Rosemary could be a result of her being tormented by the haunting rather than her showing any kind of proclivity for premonitions. Bond could have also had an additional reason for stalking Rosemary and Sophie other than tormenting Rosemary if he isn't Jack Walton, and that is that he could be attempting to learn as much about Rosemary as possible before attempting to lure her to her death. There's some visual evidence for this too. When he shows up to Rosemary in her jail cell to let her out and allow her to walk off to where she'll be killed, he appears to be looking very similar to how Jack looked in their wedding footage that is showed earlier, all the way down to having the same kind of silver glow that can be caused by black and white projection equipment. This, however, could also be explained by Jack wanting to watch his family and essentially astral projecting, which is not a real thing, but it's real in fiction, to monitor his family from the restaurant. And now I think I'm going to get into a bit of a problem with trying to discuss exactly what's going on in the story if I don't take a side with my predictions. So, Chapter 3. A review becomes hard to do without predictions. Subtitle, Why We Need to Stop Saying Theory. With this last bit of playing both sides of the who is Bond question, I feel like it's going to be a lot easier to continue along this line of discussion if I actually endorse a specific prediction. But first, a word from our sponsor. Me! This is not a theory! Theories are just what people do when they forget what the proper word to describe a prediction is. The big difference is whether or not you're actually using real evidence or fan casting, and a lot of people are using the word theory to make up for the fact that what they're creating are these kinds of AUs in their head of how they'd love a series to go if they were the ones doing the payoff. I really think we need to stop calling everyone's guesses about what is going to happen in an episodic narrative a theory. Because if the theories build off of evidence that the author's inserting, elements of foreshadowing and anything associated with the character, called motifs of the character, into the story, try to lead the audience in a specific direction, then you're making a prediction. You're not doing a theory. If you happen to get a prediction that uses evidence from the text wrong, then you've fallen for what's called a red herring. And it doesn't necessarily mean that your guess was wrong. What it means is that you incorporated information that the author used to mislead you and keep the mystery of the text a little ambiguous until they're ready for the reveal. I feel like the real reason that a lot of young fandoms have incorporated theorizing directly goes back to the dreaded bear and how barren, haha pun, the field of evidence was, and in many ways still is, for lending answers to the questions floating around the Five Nights at Freddy intergame narratives. Now, back to your regularly scheduled Walton Files discussion. As much as it pains me to say it as a father of three myself, I think that Jack Walton is probably Bond in some way. However, I am hedging my bets here and adding that the character Felix Kranken is likely in some way also directly responsible for the way that Jack is acting. My first point here is that the cover image that was uploaded on Find Jack Walton shows the Bond animatronic with exactly one soul in it, which disproves the idea that the suit is cohabitated by Jack with someone with more sinister intentions who is suppressing Jack's presence in the suit. I never really bought that theory in the first place. I thought it was too convoluted and it felt like very much a relic of FNAF fandom. But I think it is important to say it does seem to be directly dismissed now by the author himself. My second point here is that the little after credit scene that came out that has Felix in police interrogation after he was at the restaurant at 4 a.m. the morning of Rosemary's disappearance essentially confirms that he's the shadow person behind her as she's entering the animatronic showroom where she's killed. There's also the frequent reassociation of Jack with a hare. Bond has been renamed to Bond the Hare as of this episode, which also connects with Wonderland because one of the characters at the Mad Hatter's Tea Party in Alice in Wonderland was the March Hare. And in the Walton Files, Wonderland is the kind of purgatory where all of these dead spirits go before they possess these animatronics. Jack is connected to the hare through what becomes part of his motif when Sophie draws him hunting rabbits, which has immediate payoff in this very episode as Rosemary sees a hare in her vision of Jack, and on the night she becomes Shaw, a hare appears to her multiple times. With these details and the theme of family, specifically evidence with Bond trying to recreate the Walton family within the animatronics, the only other person that I could see making sense would be if the spirit inside of Bond is a placeholder of some kind for Felix before he dies. Some kind of specter, demon, or other such entity that Felix sent to recreate the Walton family to wait for him until his death. It's also possible that Felix is trying to use Jack Walton's soul for that purpose, so I'm going to be moving forward with the idea that Bond is Jack if it comes up anywhere else in my personal reading of the story as it's progressing. It might be confusing to some people, from a production standpoint, why Bond has a different voice actor than Jack if they're intended to be the same person, and there are really two answers for that which immediately came to my mind. The first is that using a different voice actor helps keep the issue ambiguous to the audience until the studio wants to confirm it for storytelling purposes. The second reason is related to what I already mentioned about Bravy's performance. Martin could probably eventually get coached to the point that he could give a similar performance, but it would introduce a ridiculous amount of scope creep in creating the series since he's already performing multiple other roles that to have him work to be talented enough to be one of the principals is probably a huge mistake, and I think one that he's correct to not be making. All production elements aside, I think ultimately making the choice to have Bond be Jack, whose repressed emotions somehow warped his essence into something more sinister than it originally was, makes the final scene all the more poignant. Bond, after infusing Rosemary's spirit into Shaw, tries to get her to repeat after him, but when he gets to the end of his mantra, he can only get her to say, "You love me," and not, "I love you." Rosemary is still Rosemary, and she's aware enough of what's happened to her in her current state that she is mortified to have been put into this position, even if it means reuniting her family. One could predict that if there's any additional characterization of her after her death, that we may realize that she's only sticking around because two of her children's souls are in the robotic stuffed animal that Jack built for them. An act that would echo the sentiment of people staying in a bad marriage because of the kids, as the animatronics have become a twisted reflection of the Walton family. This brings to mind the employees in the other animatronics, which I take will be used as a thematically relevant way to bolster the idea that your corporate family replaces your real family in the period of neoliberalization that started around the area of when guys like Felix would have wanted to make chains like Bond's Burgers into international businesses. You can see a direct conflict in the idea of creating a national restaurant chain with what Rosemary wanted to do with her art, which was to create puppets to build a kind of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood style TV show. There's also reason to think that Paredes and his team have a decent depth in their knowledge of Americana, because before Rosemary's disappearance, Sophie asks her to watch the Carol Burnett show. If we were working with a more shallow knowledge of American culture, then I think it's safe to say that Saturday Night Live would have been at play here, which is why, to me, the hollowing out of the American family with corporatization is an intentional theme here, especially when you consider as well that the family has been bound to literal corporate mascots. One last prediction for what the series is building toward before I depart. I suspect that as we as an audience continue to get more videos that talk about the fate of the other people who were killed by Bond, that we will also be getting more and more snippets of what is happening with Sophie, such as the picture of her pill bottle and the ringing phone at the end of this episode. I know that 2 seasons are planned in for the series, but I'm not sure if Paredes' studio plans to explore Sophie in season 1, or if her character arc will be explored almost entirely in season 2. Regardless, I expect a season finale of season 1 that contains significantly more present-day Sophie so that we as an audience can begin to develop an idea of what the ramifications of these killings are on Sophie in what is the current present day for the series. The Walton Files has been a fantastic series for highlighting how much an author has grown over a period of time. We've gone from sketches with MS Sam style voiceovers to a fully voice-acted and animated movie-length cartoon. I don't think I've seen people on the Panpopticon, the service that allows me to scry into all possible pop culture takes and all possible timelines, talk about exactly how impressive it is that Paredes now has a fledgling animation studio at only 26. That's not to say there's not much more room for growth, call me Martin, but in my mind, the Walton Files has a proven track record now of growing not just in production value, but also in terms of how much artistry is involved in that production. I hope you've enjoyed my examination into how consuming horror beyond just the mascot subgenre is connected to the growth of the series and craftsmanship, the FNAF connection, my theory on theories, and my predictions for what ideas the story might be working toward based on this episode. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know with a like or comment. I typically do lengthier explication, which is talking about the themes while reading aloud of old narratives, and this is my first time really putting together a video effort post on a web series. I was considering doing one on Morley Grove, and right as I sat down to start it, the announcement trailer for this was plastered all over my timeline, and frankly, I'm glad I found it. I will be stopping by in Morley Grove most likely before moving on to my next planned genre classics video on the King in Yellow. That's it for me for this one, folks. Stay golden out there.